Hi, Kath.
Hi, Sarah.
As you know, my name is Sarah Gilligan and I'm a coach for the creative industry. This is Kath Melbourne. Kath has an extensive career in the arts, working as a CEO for Legs on the Wall, is a well-known arts reviewer, has worked in policy development and government across pretty much all the art forms.
Yeah. I'm what they call a unicorn, apparently. When I went and did some work in South Africa, she said, you do visual and performing arts. I said, yeah. She said, you're a unicorn.
Doing a bit of research for the relationship between art and democracy, which is what we're here to talk about today, I was looking at, okay, well, what is the definition of democracy and what is the definition of art? And they're slippery suckers.
They are indeed.
And what we're going to talk about today, if we look at the Western liberal democracy that we operate under in this country, and art, well, what would your definition of art be?
Well, art is a focused expression of humanity. And that definition of humanity is as broad as it is an expression of a community, cultural expression, whether that be ethnicity or indigeneity. It's a layered, intelligent investigation of personal relationships. In storytelling, and that storytelling can take the shape of song, abstract sound, visual printmaking, photography, theatre, contemporary dance, literature. It's a rich, deep and never-ending world art. As artists get more tools to work with, so does the art change. Virtual reality work is a classic. And so also do the dilemmas come for the ethics of the art for the artist and what play and what relationship that has with the democracy it exists in.
What dilemmas?
Well, I mean, if you take, as you sort of said before, the Western democracy that we live in currently, I think there are probably a couple of things to unpack within that, and that is that who controls the narrative and who is that democracy for? On the basis of this country, there have been times in which, for example, the entire Indigenous population was excluded from that democracy because they were classed as plants and animals. And plants and animals can't practice a culture, they can't practice a language, they can't make an art that transfers that history onto future generations. And in fact, those practices were banned as a tool in terms of creating an assimilated colonial democracy. There's a trickiness around who that's for. A cultural dominance is happening in terms of men telling Australian stories, and that's right across the art form. And I'm not saying that because I have any problem with men's art. Some of my favourite artists are men, but it's statistics.
In a Western liberal democracy, with the way that the arts are generally funded and supported, do you think there's a rub? Does it become curated by funding?
Yes, on a number of levels. One, it's very, very difficult to make a financial living as an artist. So, when you are making your career as an emerging artist, whether it be coming from your formal training or starting to make a living from the art that you make, either, you are going to spend a great deal of your time in another job and a great deal of your energy in another job while that income starts building. Or you come from a family with money. And that essentially can put you a step ahead. Whether that be through access to formal training or access to money to be able to further their career or connections within their family and social circle. So you can see that some people don't have as much access to the systems of government which fund it. So that's why a government, whether it's a local government, and in fact a local government can see probably more at a grassroots level who isn't connected to the system. I might just break apart the system because some people, I think particularly artists, they don't understand how the system works. I'll put it within the framework of the questions you've asked me in terms of democracy, because at each level of funding level does have different consequences for democracy. So, you know, as I said at a local level, your final sign-off on who is getting the money within that particular area is the politicians. Same with your state governments. You're going to have a panel that's taken from people in the industry and peers who, you know, you hope will have their finger on the pulse, and they make a recommendation. They're not a board or anything like that. They make a recommendation to the minister, and the bureaucrats in the, and I don't mean bureaucrats as a negative sense, it's just that they are facilitating the mechanisms of government, and they will take this list to the minister's office and say these are the ones that were recommended by the peers, and the minister has really two choices. They can trust the decision of the panel. They say, well, we appoint these peers for this purpose.
Yep.
I'm happy for this to go to head. It sits within the budget. Here we go.
Yep.
The trickiest times have happened when the minister has actually said, no, I want to override the decision of these peers, and I want to make something based on a feeling or someone who's approached me.
That process that you explained about the peer review and all of that is quite a democratic system of
people trust that
selection of or curation of artworks. Whereas to have one person putting the pen through goes against one of the core pillars of democracy, which is about a suspicion of centralised power. Democratisation of the tools of art is actually changing the cultural landscape.
Yeah, you were talking about that yesterday.
Yeah, so the fact that, you know, when I was young, if I wanted to be a filmmaker, I had to kind of know somebody, get the gear, do all of that sort of stuff. Now, you know, we've all got all of this amazing technology on our phones to make art. In terms of that, where the identity of these cultural institutions and art forms that have been traditionally so dependent on government support as being core to what art is, do you see that that's going to change and that they're going to need to change their models?
Look, a lot of the heritage art forms that we're talking about, I'll just pick up on the symphony, the ballet and the opera in those. They also are very expensive to put on.
Yeah.
So, you know, you are employing multiple artists. You are spending money on the richness and lushness of the situation in which they perform and in the instruments they play with. And that costs money, and the market forces aren't going to pay that amount of money that it costs to put it on. Out of the major performing arts organisations supported, you've also got two odd ones out of that bunch, which is Bangarra and Circus Oz. And you think about circus as an art form. While it does have a heritage background, well, it has a history. They're as a company, they've modernised circus. They're clearly not using animals. They speak from a contemporary point of view. All their shows aren't an existing script, an existing composition, as they do in the other art forms, which makes them non-heritage. So there are some things I think they can learn from those organisations doing lush, full casts and layered sets and large touring budgets, of course. That about audiences, about breaking down access and about democratising what they do. As a programmer, at an art centre or a festival, you know, your decisions aren't necessarily democratic, because I think as a curator, you also have a role to represent and to push art forms and to challenge audiences as well. And as you're challenging them and as you're growing what art is, then you are going to take risks. For example, we were both speaking about Dark Mofo and about Mona. Is that, you know, if we were to sit here today and go, the key to bringing lots of people who have never seen the arts to the arts is to create a dark museum with lots of bodily fluids, death, sex, you know. And it's going to get the droves in.
Off. and then, hasn't it?
And then we're going to get 45,000 people to come into town. They're all going to be walking around in the middle of Hobart winter. So from a backwater that whose primary tourism market was the retirees and camper vans, and it was a place to go to retire. It's now the Gen Y place to go, and is rising in those numbers more than any other place in Australia. So you switch the narrative around it, and it had to be good.
Yeah.
You know, and Tasmanians interestingly embraced it more because it didn't involve government money.
He calls himself God in his car park, but he's giving it a go.
I don't like him as a person, but geez, he's done some good things for Tasmania. He's brought some brilliant artists from all around the world to Tasmania, and that creates a conversation between artists that are here. It creates a benchmark to rise towards, and more I see Dark Mofo investing in the pathway of local artists, which I love. That's been a criticism of them in the past. They're very democratic in the sense that they celebrate their bad reviews too. Yep. So, they don't try to shut down other voices that are critical of them.
Yeah.
One thing that's become a trend over time is that the government certainly doesn't like to be criticised in public. So the way it curates its national narrative on the world stage is very carefully. You see that in the Olympic Games ceremony, the classic moment where they gather around a circle of Indigenous elders from all over Australia. And there's this moment of, oh yes, the Aboriginal people are such a rich part of our culture today. And unfortunately for them, they decided to take a historical narrative approach to the opening ceremony. And of course, we all know what comes next. And they decided to show that by James Cook coming in on a giant boat, and lots of soldiers. And then the Aboriginal people the elders, they just quietly left stage left.
I remember that. They did, didn't they? They just shuffled exit stage left.
And we know that moment everyone gets shot.
Yeah.
But we're not going to have those kind of conversations through art in a national realm.
Should we be?
Look, I think they've come close to it in their selections of, say, for example, the Venice Biennale.
Yeah.
The Australian artists that they've chosen to go over there in terms of their narratives and their criticisms of race in Australia, or feminism, in fact, or indigeneity with the Tracy Moffat. So they are bold enough to take those steps forward, but also they're taking them in a step forward where it's not a marketing exercise, it's not World Expo, it's surrounded by artists that are also taking that leap. So, it's not just the Australian pavilion that's having those critical conversations.
It's a global conversation that we're joining in on.
Yes, and in fact that it would look bad if we weren't joining it. It'd look like we've got something to hide more if we weren't part of that conversation.
Are the arts responsible for upholding democracy?
They play a very strong role because if you think about the opposite of what happens to the arts in a non-democratic country or a non-democratic situation, you see that the arts are used to ingrain the particular cultural narrative that they want to continue. So, for example, in a country like Laos, you will find poetry and sanctioned songs broadcast in the street through loudspeakers, and you'll see youngsters tapping into Thai soap operas and music as a small act of defiance because they want to understand about relationships. And under a communist rule, considering those things in art is considered a luxury, something that is a bit indulgent. And interesting, they're on a cusp where they're not silencing that Thai music and that Thai television, but they're also walking a fine line because they're still trying to ingrain the other stuff in it. You go to the Ubud Writers Festival, and again, Indonesia's a country battling with the different transitions and different tensions in there, and of course art plays a role about that because the difference, of course, is that if we went down to the Melbourne Writers Festival this week, there wouldn't be an armoured police tank, waiting outside the venue. Yeah. So I think that you can see the tensions and advantages and how we've come to expect that we have these freedoms of expression. Yep. And you see it when it's contrasted against places that don't.
What role do our street artists? What role is our public art in telling a story about contemporary Australia?
I'm going to throw back a question to you.
Go for it.
Is that what do you think the journey of street art tells us about our democracy. So, for example, the first reaction to street art was to shut it down completely, to paint over it as stopping a practice of political defiance or societal defiance. It was given the kind of title of being a gateway drug to other forms of vandalism. And now to where, a city is using it to promote the very nature of a city.
Is it embraced in its wholeness, or is it embraced in we like this laneway? And because it says all of these fabulous things about us culturally.
The government has tried to control this very democratic form of art by placing it into particular areas, by sanctioning it in particular areas.
It seems everything starts as a freedom of expression, and when it has to fit into a system of government with its local and national rules and what have you, it cannot help but be curatorial.
Yes. With public art, for instance, in a local government process that's, pretty well, worn in nowadays, is that, you'll do a call out for design. Some members of the public and your panel will shortlist those designs. Then you'll take the designs out to the general public, and they'll, everyone has an opinion on public art.
Oh, yeah.
The more innovative people in that placemaking space are actually saying, let's create spaces, not let's create a space and then plonk a statue in it. Let's make those spaces flexible, and in fact that people can end up making their own art in them.
People who are artists or
general public.
Yeah, right.
So that's the simple thing is an amphitheatre in a park.
Yeah, I was watching something the other day on one of the most beautiful democratic art installations, if you could call it that. Was Burning Man.
Oh, yeah.
People come, they gather, they bring art, and they make art together. And anyone can bring art into the desert. The only rules are that at the end of the festival, it either needs to be burnt or it has to be carted out and stored. So it becomes this community, and I first came across it because I was working with some Canadian grips on a film, and they were talking about how they go, because their skills of kind of engineering knowledge and rigging and all of that sort of stuff, they just go, and there are communities of all sorts of people who don't come from an artistic background that go, and thousands of humans come together and make together.
Yeah, right.
And then there is nothing that is for sale.
I do remember reading an article where the festival was grappling with that stuff because they had commercial sponsors wanting to create VIP areas or all this kind of stuff, and they said, actually, no, that's veering us away. Why we set this up.
And it removes that feeling for people of, I might not get it.
Yeah.
I might not be culturally aware enough. I might not be educated enough. I might not be, but people experiencing art for what it actually is, to climb on it. Some of these things are just extraordinary. Years and years and years of work, and then you see it go up in flames.
Do you think that Australia could do something like that? Or is our crutch in terms of government funding in this democracy so ingrained in us that we wouldn't be able to just simply create something, take the risk? And it's an incredibly risky proposition. You'd have no idea what art is coming as a festival director, no idea what art is coming. You've got no idea. You do have some idea about how many people. Yes. You've got no control over the weather. Yep. You have basically no idea about what the event's going to be created because the people who are coming are creating it.
Yeah.
But a festival as a democratic act of bringing a community together. Yeah. And creating what they think having the conversations, creating the conversations around the community and what is important is. I feel more and more in this country we're paralysed a little bit by the funding system.
You've got a lot of experience in working in the funding of the arts. What do you think? Do you think that it has to exist outside of government funding? Is it about collaborations with business? Is it about collaborations with, the ideologically, aligned? And not having anything from government, or is it about us shifting the government funding?
Well, I think as a government funder, some of the success rates federally have fallen to between 8 and 12%, after the successive cuts. So I would ask an artist, are you willing to actually enter into one mode of doing thing that's going to give you up to a 92% chance of failure? So do we then want to create something that helps them not to make the same mistakes over and over and over in their career, in their relationship with funders? Or do we want to create something that actually allows people to think about, say in the case with ArtStart, a strategy about how your career can be sustainable and how you make a living from it? And what you have to get them to think about is the fact that whether or not you get $10,000, you've worked out that it's $10,000 you need.
When they don't get that funding, they often feel totally shut down and stop making their art.
Yep.
And then feel like whatever side job that they've had to get, because let's face it, most artists are,
Absolutely.
Certainly in my coaching clients, I was going through testimonials the other day and I was looking and it was sort of like, photographer and lecturer, and they were all and.
Well, when your average artist's income is still sitting around $12,000 a year. Yeah.
So clearly art's not, the artists aren't making it for profit. How does the individual artist then keep navigating, keep going and create legacy that helps other artists?
Well, you really have to build the value on a societal level of handmade, of the craft of making art, of the craft of voice, of the benefit in a community sense to what art does. Like, so say for example that ceramicist made this.
Yes.
And it became the latest thing. Everybody needed one of these. So there is the artist just banging out these particular reproductions of what they did before.
Yep.
If they get rich enough, they'll outsource their studio practice to somebody else, and they'll just keep banging it out. But the artists that have had a more sustained career, when you think about, I think about Ridgeline Pottery, because we're talking about pottery, which is a famous studio in Tasmania. And he's made the decision to subvert, when something's becoming too popular, to subvert it and stop doing it.
Great.
And Ben Richardson, who's the primary potter in that studio, he will say things like, you need to stop just making art in a bubble. You need to start to broaden the value of art in the industries that surround it, so that you work in an ecosystem. Yeah. For him, of course, it's food and beverage. Yeah. So who are the people in food and beverage that have similar values to him? That like to do things with care, that like to do things on a small scale, that have resisted, scaling up and franchising. And he's finding them around him. And funnily enough, their shared values bring them together in a place that then increases the value of what they both do.
Yeah. Do you think that sort of collaboration and that thinking can happen on a bigger scale, or is that happening more at the sort of the smaller individual?
Well, I think it is. You've been reading some of the interesting dialogue that's coming out of Russell Howcraft, and just drilling down to the connectors that arts and creativity have with other industries which are focused on imagination. So imagination and creativity is really so linked to innovation, to risk-taking, to progress, to seeing beyond what currently exists. Yes. And to foster those thinking, it's not necessarily that those things can be automated. I think that you were talking the other day about the increasing need for these kind of skills in a modern workforce. So I think the danger, though, is that arts also needs to sit on its own with its own power, because I think that you can easily have art swallowed up within this bigger context of imagination and creativity, which embraces industries like advertising and marketing.
But I feel like there is going to be some sort of bypassing of government in terms of the financial sustainability of art.
Yeah. Look, I'd still like to make the case for arm's length funding in the same way that I would make the case for a national broadcaster. So arm's length funding is the Australia Council, the federal example, where you have a statutory body set up at arm's length from the government. So the final decisions, they have a board structure, and the final decisions or the final recommendations are being made by panels, and the board signs off on them. So there are ministerial appointments to that particular board, the Australia Council, but it's not the same situation that I was talking about with the state ministers. So they don't have the pen on the final decision. They can, however, choose to say, take the arts budget, carve it up, give it some to arm's length funding, and take some of it directly through their own department. And they all do that because they've all got pet projects, they've all been lobbied, they've all got things that they want to achieve, and that will change from government to government. Without the arm's length funding, they will be able to direct it, say, to the James Cook celebrations in terms of memorialising that through statue. Pete Garrett chose, when he was Minister, for Art Start, which was the project that I ended up delivering and designing in the end. So, that is a tool. That money that they take is a statement enough to say, I'm taking that away from arm's length funding, I'm taking it away from that democratic peer-based process, and I'm making a direct decision on it. So while they don't decide, make the final sign-off over there.
What size pot.
Exactly.
Is it about business and the arts collaborating more?
Look, I think that definitely plays a part in it, but I mean, the value set needs to be aligned. There are some in the government currently that say that let's get rid of arts funding altogether because that's the most democratic way to do it, is allow market forces to completely dictate. I know. And then look at the industry. Anyone who's in the industry usually pulls that face too.
Yeah, just got a little bit of vomit in my throat.
Yeah, because then, you don't, it's completely dictated by market forces, and you're not going to get stories told, for example, by working class people. Same with recent migrants, same with Indigenous people, and class plays into both those areas as well. So, to do away with it, I don't think is a democratic act.
No.
Because if you're looking at a broad representation of voice and acknowledging the diversity of individuals within that democratic society, then by your nature, by doing that, you are cutting off the voice of many, many people who aren't in a position of privilege. You need those disruptors. You need those people asking the questions, how can we do something differently? And leadership, whether it's in arts funding or some of those major companies, plays a big role as well into, how successful the system is. It's about the integrity of their leadership, their capacity to see their own company or their own organisation or their own department within the ecosystem of everything else that goes around it. But I think as leaders, we do have a responsibility. And for you who coaches arts leaders, you have this brilliant capacity as a coach to really drill down into the layers of people. It's that, drilling down from the ego, taking the ego. We don't need that. We can pick it up later if we want to pick it up.
That.
And you obviously have taken that responsibility on in terms of your direction and your coaching practice. And we all play a role in that.
Because of the lack of money in the industry, and because people who work in the arts certainly don't go in there to make a buck. We also see a loss of wisdom and knowledge and continuity that happens because people have to go out and get their bread and butter jobs and their day jobs and once people start having families in the arts, well, that's when it gets really hard. There is an intensity, there's long hours, there's lots of commitment, there's lots of passion. And it is really, like when I think about my career, it was really a young person's game that I strung out for a good 25 years. And you see that there's a whole lot of young people who don't have those pressures of having to earn a living or make money or the commercial sort of aspect of their art, champing at the bit, ready to get in.
They can drink all night, get up in the morning, work again.
Yeah, and there's not
in your mid-30s you can't do it.
I'm seeing less and less and less of that relationship of people in the arts looking after their own. And so before you were talking about that thing of the arts having to sit on its own and how it navigates.
Well, stand on its own within its own values.
Yeah.
You know, it's going to survive by its connection to other parts of the ecosystem, but it's more not to be cannibalised, I think, by other forms of creativity and imagination. To be able to stand in its right and voice what its uniqueness is. You know, it's. I mean, yes, you could say advertising tells the story of a generation. But it's a very manipulated story to, and you could say that about art.
I was about to say, how's that different from the?
Oh, we've got ourselves a corker there. Yeah, so an advertiser will craft a message together to get a particular reaction from its audience.
Yes.
Whether that's to buy that, to feel awful enough about themselves that they think a lipstick will change their life, or, you know, as a director going and saying, I'm going to, you know, create an atmosphere in this scene to make an audience feel a particular thing. Or I'm going to make the audience feel exhilarated enough that they're going to tell their friends to buy a ticket to come and see my show.
Because they're participating in that experience. They're not buying it and experiencing it in solitude.
The audience?
The audience. Now, I'm going to particularly talk about theatre here, and I might be going off on one of my, you know.
Go for it.
You go to the movies, and you go to the movies in the middle of the day. Love doing that. And you go there, and there's nobody else in the cinema.
Yes.
And you just feel like you've hit the jackpot.
Yes.
And that movie is just for you. So that lipstick is just for you. That movie is just for me. You walk into a theatre and there's a mainly empty auditorium.
It's awkward.
It's
It's really awkward.
It's awful.
Yeah.
Because you go there for an experience with people and with your humanity and to share an experience. And that to me is the difference between something that is manipulative and, yes, you know, what the director is trying to do is manipulate a whole audience into feeling the same thing, but not everybody's going to.
But I want to pick up on a point that you were just saying before about people's desire to have the communal experience. It's really interesting because I think I felt for quite some time that music is the art form of our generation. It's everywhere you go. It's in your car. It's in your earphones. It's absolutely everywhere. Now, what my colleagues in the senior positions in the music industry are saying is that all the money to be made in music at the moment is the live experience. I mean, I think that's an interesting turn, particularly in an environment which has heavily changed the music industry in terms of online streaming.
Yep.
No one goes and buys a CD anymore. Occasionally, there's a few record stores. As a form of
Specialist
nostalgia.
Niche.
Yeah, but now that's turned around and said, we want to experience this live. We want that experience because we're not getting it in other parts of our lives.
So with everything that we talked about, with the arts relying on funding, on government funding, on the system of government in whatever country it sits in, where to for the arts?
Look, I think that we need to be comfortable with a kind of infinite tension between the two. And in fact, the tension is what creates the progress. The understanding of the different creates a connection between humanity.
Yeah.
The arts has the ability to do these things in a way that doesn't bring out weapons.
It's a peaceful way.
Just because they're having difficult conversations, it doesn't mean it needs to be a violent, difficult conversation. There's a playwright, Australian Aboriginal playwright, that I quite admire, and he came from the protest movement into writing, and he said, I worked out with my writing that I didn't always need to yell to get my point across. And I think that is what arts does, because sometimes yelling makes people not want to listen. So the arts has the ability to progress, to ask those difficult questions, to take those risks, to be one step ahead of where society is at the time. And the government should be listening to artists, and artists should be talking to government.
So, well, the arts is probably more democratic than our democracy is.
In some ways, this is true. And until you get a director in a room who says that my word is king and everybody is here to do what I say, and that's it, that art can also be the greatest dictatorship as well as the greatest democracy.
You look at some of the dictatorships and how they've treated art. It is really interesting because they do have a whole. They've got a high value of art because it's used as propaganda.
Yeah.
And they train people in the basic skills, and sure, is to toe the political line and whatever.
And the theatre involved in those big outdoor spectacles with the army, with
massive,
yeah,
massive.
It's classic
it's
operatic. Yeah,
it is ingrained, and I guess the ideal would be to have that ingrained in our cultural day-to-day life and way of life, and to have training provided for artists and what have you, but that then they can also actually have freedom of speech within that.
Indeed.
That's a big call.
Look, girl's got a dream.